Ethan Walker thought he'd inherited nothing but a dead vineyard and a winter of debt. But one freezing night, Shadow, his battle-worn German shepherd, tore through the silence and scratched at the sealed stone floor of the old wine cellar. When Ethan broke the cement, he didn't find spoiled bottles or forgotten tools. He found a wooden box, a Swiss bank key, and a coded note tied to millions that vanished decades ago. And before sunrise, strangers were already watching the hills. If this story draws you in, share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Winter on the dying vineyard. Sun drifted down the valley in slow, heavy sheets. The wind scraped across the hills above Seneca Lake like a blade, carrying with it a chill that made Ethan Walker tighten the collar of his navy parka. He stood beside his aging pickup truck, one hand braced on the cold metal door, the other resting on the harness of the German shepherd beside him. Shadow, 5 years old and bred for duty, had a broad frame, a thick winter coat of black and tan, and eyes the color of amber glass warmed by firelight. Even now, those eyes scanned the horizon with practiced vigilance, as if expecting the world to attack without warning. Ethan felt the same way. His body held the memory of war too well. He had once been a Navy SEAL, the kind of man who could slip through night water without disturbing a ripple, who could hold his breath longer than fear itself. But the Ethan standing in the frozen mud now was a quieter version of that soldier. He was 40, with wind-burned skin, a jaw shadowed by 3 days of stubble, and a limp born from a blast that had torn into his left knee during an extraction gone wrong. The limp had become more pronounced this past winter. Cold made the joint seize like rusted machinery. He shifted his weight, feeling the familiar stab of pain. Life after discharge had not been generous. Employers smiled, thanked him for his service, then turned him away because his resume didn't translate into office spreadsheets. His savings dried up, debt notices piled on the cracked tile floor of his Buffalo apartment, and the constant ringing of unknown numbers became a soundtrack he hated. He tried drinking to sleep. That didn't work either. Shadow was the only steady thing in those months, guarding the doorway as if he could shield Ethan from creditors and nightmares alike. Then the lawyer called. The woman on the phone had a clipped professional voice and cool patience. Her name was Janet Norwell, a thin woman in her 50s with silver-streaked brown hair, sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses, and a tone that suggested she had delivered more bad news than good in her life. She explained that Ethan had inherited a vineyard from an uncle he barely remembered, a man who had lived isolated on the hills above Seneca Lake. There was one condition. Ethan must also take responsibility for the animal living on the property. At the time, Ethan scoffed. "I already have a deed," he'd said. He didn't want another obligation, another creature relying on him when he could barely rely on himself. But the next letter from the bank threatened immediate action. After that, he packed his duffel, loaded Shadow into the passenger seat, and drove north through the storm. Now he was here, and the property was worse than expected. Before him stretched a vineyard long abandoned. The wooden posts leaned like tired men, their wires sagging under the weight of dead vines wrapped in brittle spirals. Snow clung to everything, turning the landscape into a field of gray bones. At the end of the winding path sat a 2-story farmhouse that had surrendered to time. Shingles curled away from the roof, window panes were cracked like spider webs, and the porch sagged under the weight of winter. The house didn't look haunted. It looked forgotten. Ethan inhaled slowly, the breath freezing in his throat. He felt the old tension coil inside him, the one he used to feel moments before a mission began. Back then, it had been a sharpened instinct, the body preparing for danger. Now, it felt like dread. "What do you think?" he muttered. Shadow didn't look at him. The dog stood poised, tail low but alert, ears angled toward the house as if reading something Ethan couldn't. Shadow had always sensed things first. Shifts in mood, approaching footsteps, even the tremor in Ethan's leg when a flashback threatened to drag him under. Snow crunched as Ethan took a hesitant step forward. All the fatigue of the past years pressed against his spine. The weight of failure, of bills stacked on a kitchen counter, of feeling unneeded by a world that had moved on without him. He had hoped, foolishly, that the inheritance might offer some kind of beginning. Instead, it looked like another dead end wrapped in ice. He walked toward the porch. Shadow moved ahead, muscles coiled, breath steaming in the air. The dog's paws barely made a sound as he inspected the area, circling twice, nose low. Ethan placed his hand on the porch railing. It groaned under his touch, brittle from years of cold. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what my life has come to. A broken house and a vineyard that died before I showed up." For a moment, anger flickered, quick, sharp, humiliating. Anger at himself for falling so far. Anger at a country that trained him to do impossible things and then expected him to shrink back into ordinary life. Anger at the uncle who had left him this burden instead of money that could have bought him a fresh start. But beneath the anger was something else, a thin pulse of resolve. He wasn't sure whether it came from the soldier he used to be or from the steady presence at his side, the dog who had followed him through hospitals, sleepless nights, and long stretches of doubt. Shadow nudged his leg now, a quiet reminder that he wasn't completely alone. Ethan looked at the vineyard again, rows of broken posts, vines frozen into twisted silhouettes, a house slumped like a defeated man. And still, something waited here, something he couldn't name yet. Snow spiraled down in cold ribbons as Ethan Walker and Shadow stood shoulder to shoulder before the dying vineyard and the decaying farmhouse, the uncertain weight of the future stretching out before them like a winter road with no lights. They had no idea what waited beneath that snow, beneath that soil, beneath the secrets this land had carried for decades. But the storm had brought them here, and something in the wind whispered that nothing about this place was accidental. Midnight bark and the sealed wine cellar, the house groaned under the winter wind, as if the beams remembered better years. Ethan Walker lay on a sagging mattress in the upstairs bedroom, staring into the dim ceiling where the lone light bulb flickered with each gust that rattled the window panes. The cold crept under the door, under the sheets, even under his skin. He shifted, knee throbbing, the old injury pulsing like an unwelcome heartbeat. Shadow lay across the threshold, a massive, steady barricade of fur and discipline. Head rested on his paws, ears twitching at every creak. Sleep didn't come easy to Ethan, not anymore. When it did, it came wrong. Tonight he drifted in and out, drifting through black water and muffled detonations, feeling again the tug of the ocean, trying to pull him under. He jerked awake with a quiet gasp that fogged in the icy air. Shadow's eyes opened instantly, glowing faint amber in the dark. For a while, silence. Then something shifted. Shadow rose without a sound. His muscles tightened, tail low, ears pointed toward the staircase. That soft, almost inaudible growl climbed in his throat, the one he never released unless something was truly there. Ethan sat up, heart sinking into old habits. He grabbed the Zeta flashlight on the nightstand and reached beneath the mattress for his combat knife, the handle familiar against his palm. He didn't question Shadow. The dog had saved him before, during panic attacks, during nights when Ethan nearly drowned in memories, and once during a break-in back in Buffalo, when the intruder didn't expect a service dog trained for military environments. Shadow moved fast. Ethan followed. They descended the narrow staircase, the wood complaining beneath Ethan's weight, while Shadow glided like smoke ahead of him. When the dog reached the back door, he barked once, short, clipped, the signal bark used in training, a warning, not fear. Ethan's breath fogged as he opened the door. Outside, snow blanketed the yard in uneven patches, the wind carving lines across the surface. Shadow bounded forward, nose to the ground, following a path that led down the slope behind the house. Ethan's boots cracked the frozen crust of snow as he followed, scans sweeping the shadows between dead vines. The entrance to the vineyard's old stone wine cellar sat half buried in the hillside. Tonight, faint lamplight reflected off something at its doorframe. Ethan approached, flashlight steady. Shadow was already there, body stiff, gaze fixed on the cellar door. The wooden planks nailed across it had been disturbed. One had been pried up at the corner, leaving a splintered edge and fresh scrape marks. Ethan crouched and brushed the snow aside. Underneath, clear as fresh ink, were footprints, large, heavy, likely a man. The stride suggested someone moving quickly, maybe retreating. Ethan straightened, scanning the valley. Far across the dark expanse, a pair of headlights blinked out, behind a cluster of pines, like a watcher slipping away. Shadow rumbled low. Ethan whispered, "Yeah, I see it too." He didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning light arrived gray and unwilling. Ethan drove into the small lakeside town, Shadow sitting tall in the passenger seat, his breath fogging the cold window. Town Hall was a squat brick building that looked as tired as the winter. Inside, Ethan met Mark Briston, a local bank officer. Mark was in his late 30s, round-shouldered, balding, and wore a rumpled tweed jacket that didn't quite fit. His voice was tentative, the voice of a man who avoided conflict and had probably spent years appeasing people stronger than himself. Mark explained that the vineyard, 40 acres, once known for producing dry reds, had been appraised at a value so low it barely covered property taxes, not even close to Ethan's debt. "So you're saying," Ethan muttered, jaw tight, "this land is worthless?" Mark gave a helpless shrug. "In its current state, nearly." When Ethan returned home, a surprise waited. A sleek black SUV, polished even in the winter grime, was parked at the edge of the driveway. The man who stepped out looked like he belonged in a Manhattan boardroom, not on a frozen hillside. He wore a dark wool coat tailored to perfection, a charcoal suit underneath, and leather gloves so fine the stitching vanished. His hair was tidy, dark blonde, parted with precision. His face was square-jawed and freshly shaved, but his eyes, icy gray, still as steel, held no warmth. "Mr. Walker," he greeted with a smooth, practiced spull. "My name is Richard Hale." Hale extended a gloved hand. Ethan didn't take it. Shadow stood between them, silent but radiating tension. His hackles rose slightly, his amber eyes locked onto Hale like a sniper marking a target. Hale continued unfazed. "I represent an investment group interested in this property. We believe its location has untapped potential. I'm authorized to offer you a purchase price significantly above county valuation." Ethan folded his arms. "How significantly?" 10 times, Hale said with a polite tilt of his head. "Immediate payment." It made no sense. Nothing here was worth that kind of money. "Why?" Ethan asked. Hale smiled again, thin, rehearsed, empty. "We value opportunities others overlook." Shadow's paws dug into the snow. Ethan felt cold crawl up his spine despite the heavy coat. "I'm not selling," he said. Hale's smile barely shifted, but something hard glinted behind his eyes. "Think it over. Time is not your ally, Mr. Walker." When the SUV disappeared down the road, Shadow remained at the path's edge long after the taillights were gone, growling under his breath. That night, Shadow woke Ethan again. No hesitation, no warning bark this time. The dog bolted down the stairs with a low, urgent snarl. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and followed, every instinct burning like an old fuse. The air outside felt colder, sharper, as though the vineyard itself held its breath. Shadow led him straight to the cellar. Ethan tore off the wooden planks with numb hands. Behind them, the stone threshold was uncomfortably cold, and under the thin layer of dirt was something unmistakably wrong. A patch of cement, newer, smoother, different color. Someone had sealed something beneath this floor, and someone else had come back last night to check it. Ethan stared at the cellar's dark mouth, snow swirling behind him, Shadow pressed close to his leg. Whatever lay buried here wasn't just a forgotten family secret. It was the reason strangers were watching him, the reason a polished man offered a fortune for dead vines, the reason Shadow wouldn't relax for a single heartbeat. Ethan wiped frost from his beard, mind racing. The vineyard was hiding something, and someone wanted it to stay buried. The cipher in the wine bottles and the shadow of dirty money. The snow fell heavier the next morning, blurring the vineyard into a white, shifting wilderness. Ethan Walker stepped out of the farmhouse with a crowbar in hand, Shadow trotting close beside him, breath steaming in the frigid air. The cellar waited like an unanswered question at the bottom of the slope, half swallowed by winter. Ethan felt tension gather in his shoulders as he approached, a quiet instinct from years of danger whispering that what he would uncover today would change everything. The planks he had ripped away the night before lay scattered, already half buried in snow. Ethan crouched, teeth gritted against the cold, and chipped at the patched cement. Shadow stood guard at the entrance, posture rigid, tail low, his head turning sharply at each shift of the wind. The dog understood something was wrong. He had understood it from the moment Richard Hale stepped onto the property. The cement gave way with a sharp crack. Beneath it lay a hollow, just big enough to hold a small wooden chest. The box was aged but crafted with care, dark wood reinforced with tarnished brass corners. Ethan pried it open. Inside, nestled among rotting cloth, rested 3 dusty wine bottles, older than he expected. Their labels were yellowed and peeling, but the wax seals pressed into each cork bore an emblem, a stylized falcon encircled by unfamiliar script. Shadow leaned forward, sniffing the air, then backed up, a signal of caution. Ethan set the bottles aside and reached deeper, fingers brushing metal. He drew out a slim brass key, the weight surprisingly heavy for its size. Along its stem, engraved faintly, was the insignia of a Swiss financial institution. Beneath it, folded with eerie precision, lay a small piece of paper filled with numbers and letters arranged in deliberate disorder. A cipher. The kind of thing people didn't write unless they needed to hide something worth killing for. By noon, Ethan was driving through town, shadow watching the passing snowbanks from the passenger seat. The truck's heater struggled against the harsh cold, but Ethan's mind was too restless to care. He needed answers, real ones. The town library sat at the end of a slushy main road, a red brick building warmed by old radiators and the dusty smell of paper. Inside, he met Sarah Whitcomb, the head librarian. Sarah was a woman in her late 40s, with shoulder-length chestnut hair that curled at the ends, pale winter skin, and warm hazel eyes behind rounded glasses. Her build was slender but sturdy, the kind of woman who carried books with ease and conversation with familiarity. A faint ink stain smudged her left thumb, suggesting she still wrote more longhand notes than emails. Her voice was soft, but the kind that sharpened when she spoke about things she cared for. Ethan showed her his uncle's name, Douglas Hartwell, and asked if any records existed. Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing the name. "He used to come here," she said, tapping her pen against her notebook. "Quiet man, always checked out ledgers and business texts. Odd for a grape farmer." She led Ethan to an archive room filled with steel cabinets and dust-coated binders. Hours passed. Ethan sifted through files, microfilms, tax records. And the story rebuilt itself. Douglas Hartwell had once been an accountant for multiple maritime shipping firms and, later, for a New York-based investment group. His employment terms were short, always a year or two, repeating in a pattern that looked less like career building and more like strategic movement. A man shifting through corporations like someone covering tracks. Then Ethan found it. A series of old internal audit summaries. Lines upon lines of unaccounted auxiliary funds, siphoned amounts that ballooned to hundreds of millions across decades, and then vanished. Not spent, not reported, just gone. His pulse tightened. This was no coincidence. The cipher, the wine bottles, the Swiss key, this was not random inheritance. He stepped outside for air, the cold biting into his lungs. Shadow followed, ears flicked forward. They crossed the parking lot toward the truck when a faint click made Ethan stop. A man sat in a parked sedan across the lot, camera lens aimed directly at Ethan. The man was in his late 30s, thin face, dark hair under a beanie, and a trimmed beard dusted with snow. His eyes narrowed behind the camera, too calm for a harmless observer. There was a quickness to him, a twitch in his jaw that spoke of nerves and training, not a local. Shadow's growl rose like thunder. The photographer stiffened, dropped his camera to the passenger seat, and peeled out of the lot so fast the snow behind him exploded in white clouds. Ethan clenched his jaw. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting for him to make the next move. The attack came sooner than expected. That night, the vineyard was quiet, except for wind cracking through dead vines. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, studying the paper with the cipher under lamplight while Shadow slept lightly at his feet. The farmhouse walls seemed to pulse with silence. Then Shadow's head jerked up, ears pricked. Before Ethan could stand, the dog lunged to the window, barking with fierce urgency. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and knife and raced outside. Two figures in heavy winter jackets were moving between the vineyard rows, silhouettes slipping through the snow. One carried something metallic. The other was crouched low, scanning the area. Shadow launched himself like a missile. The nearest intruder didn't even have time to shout. Shadow plowed into him with full force, knocking him backward into the snow, growling with a violent authority that came from military breeding. The second intruder fired a warning shot into the sky, the sound cracking through the valley. Ethan ducked instinctively, heart hammering. Like the old missions. But these weren't insurgents or enemy combatants. They were businessmen's shadows, hired from the darkest corners of corporate operations. The second man fled into the vineyard, disappearing into the black rows of vines. Shadow stood over the first intruder, who scrambled away in panic, dropping a sleek black laptop in the snow. Ethan retrieved it, chest tight. They weren't just watching him now. They were escalating. And every sign pointed toward one truth. He had stepped into a battlefield he didn't understand. One that wore suits instead of uniforms and left secrets buried instead of bodies. Apex and the order to erase the bloodline. The storm did not break for days. Ice clung to the windows like frostbitten veins, and the wind shoved against the boards with the persistence of something alive. Ethan Walker stayed inside the farmhouse with Shadow pressed close, both man and dog, navigating the same narrow circles of worry and vigilance. The only warmth in the house came from the small propane heater and the blue glow of the seized laptop, its cold light washing over Ethan's face as he hunched at the kitchen table. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. His fingers moved with controlled precision, tapping key after key, breaking through encrypted directories one file at a time. Military training, particularly cyber-probing modules from joint operations, was now his only advantage. Shadow lay under the table, head tucked atop his paws, his thick winter coat rising and falling with steady breaths. He wasn't resting. His ears twitched at every vibration, every shift of wind against wood. Several times he pressed his muzzle to Ethan's knee, sensing the tension building inside his partner like a loaded spring. Hours crawled, then the screen flickered, folders opened, lines of text unfurled. Ethan's breath stilled. He found them. Emails under the domain of Apex Holdings, a name he didn't recognize until now. The first thing that struck him was the tone, clipped, clinical, almost bureaucratic. But beneath that veneer lived violence and greed. Ethan scrolled, jaw tightening as he read through internal memos detailing shadow accounts, corporate shells, and foreign transfers. Every number matched the cipher from the seller and the notes found in Douglas Hartwell's hidden stash. Then he saw the file that made him freeze, a report addressed to the Apex Executive Board, written by Field Handler R. Hale. Richard Hale, the elegantly dressed man with predatory eyes, was not a simple investor. He was Apex's frontline operative, the one dispatched to manage problematic heirs. The report was brief. The inheritor shows signs of resistance. He does not appear motivated by financial incentive. Recommendation: consider termination of beneficiary line to ensure unobstructed reclamation. Ethan's heart thudded once, too hard, and Shadow stood instantly, tail rigid, sensing the spike in adrenaline. The German shepherd nudged Ethan's thigh, grounding him, reminding him to breathe. Erase the bloodline, a neat, polite way of saying, kill him. Ethan leaned back in the chair, hands sliding over his beard, the 5-day stubble rough beneath his palm. For the first time in weeks, the weight of his situation settled fully on his shoulders. He wasn't just holding an inheritance, he was holding a fuse. But he wasn't alone. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had been given by Alexis Monroe, a young attorney in Syracuse. Alexis was in her early 30s, sharp-featured with tightly bound black curls, warm brown skin, and a clipped and assertive voice shaped by years of fighting for veterans' rights. Her demeanor always held a hint of grief. Her older brother, a Marine sergeant, had been killed overseas. The loss had carved her into someone who refused to let other soldiers fall through the cracks. When Ethan explained what he'd uncovered, Alexis's voice hardened. Don't go to local police. Send everything to me. I'll route it to federal contacts who owe me favors. Apex isn't small. They're international. You need people with real authority. Within hours, Ethan uploaded the files to an encrypted portal she provided. Copies of the Swiss key, photos of the wine seals, scans of the cipher, and pages of Douglas's meticulous handwritten records. Alexis called back. The FBI is mobilizing. They believe you. Just stay alive until they arrive. But Apex moved first. The night before the federal arrest order was scheduled to drop, snow battered the vineyard like an ocean breaking against stone. Ethan sat by the front window, boots on, knife sheathed at his side, shadow pressed against his feet. Something in the wind felt wrong, too charged, too purposeful. Shadow's head snapped up a second before Ethan heard it. Engines. 2 black SUVs tore through the vineyard's lower gate, headlights sweeping across rows of dead vines like searching eyes. Snow kicked up in white plumes behind them. Move, Ethan whispered. They sprinted outside into the blizzard, ducking between tangled vines for cover. The cold ripped through Ethan's parka as he hobbled through drifts of snow, knees screaming with each step. Shadow stayed glued to his side, body low, muscles taut as piano wire. Fan out, a voice barked, a deep male voice carried by the wind. Flashlights cut through the vineyard, boots stomped over snow. They were searching methodically. Ethan's Navy SEAL instinct snapped back like muscle memory. He motioned Shadow forward, guiding him to weave through the vines until they reached a sloped patch of frozen ground. His plan was desperate but necessary. The slope was steep and icy, dangerous for anyone moving fast. Ethan tossed a chunk of wood to the opposite side. It clattered loudly. Voices erupted. Flashlights pivoted. The first gunshot cracked across the vineyard. Shadow barked sharply, but stayed low. Ethan hit the ground, breath sharp. "Walker!" a voice shouted through the storm. "Last chance!" He didn't answer. A figure lunged over the rise, weapon raised. Ethan glimpsed a thick build, a bearded jawline framed by a black balaclava and heavy tactical boots. The man aimed directly at Ethan's chest, but Shadow exploded forward. The dog slammed into the attacker with a force that echoed through the rows, knocking the barrel off center. The shot fired past Ethan's shoulder, cutting a white streak into the storm. The gunman staggered, boots skidding on. Ice. He fell backward down the slope, landing hard. His gun flew from his hand and vanished beneath a pile of snow. The other SUV revved hard, too hard for the icy terrain. Tires lost traction. The vehicle slid sideways toward a shallow ravine. Then, sirens. Faint at first, then louder, echoing across the hills like deliverance. The attackers scrambled back to their vehicles, abandoning the fight. One SUV managed to escape. The other, stuck at a dangerous angle, was left behind. Shadow returned to Ethan, panting, snow clinging to his coat. Ethan grabbed the dog's collar, pressing his forehead briefly against Shadow's. "Good boy," he whispered, breath shaking. They watched the flashing red and blue lights crest the hill. The storm had not yet passed, but help had finally found them. The vineyard reborn and the haven for soldiers, winter sunlight drifted weakly across the Seneca hills, catching on the blanket of snow that still covered the vineyard. But for the first time since Ethan Walker had arrived here, half broken, half drowning, and completely lost, the land no longer looked like a graveyard. It looked like a beginning, a first breath. The case against Apex Holdings had detonated across national headlines like controlled explosions. For weeks, every news channel carried segments narrated by clean-cut anchors and legal analysts with sharp opinions. They spoke of frozen offshore accounts, shadow investments, and a decades-long laundering network disguised under layers of corporate respectability. But in all those swirling storms of information, one truth stood clear. Douglas Hartwell had not been a thief. He had been a shield, one who chose secrecy over complicity. Ethan heard those words repeated in court, in interviews, in legal summaries Alexis Monroe forwarded to him each night. Alexis herself had stood proudly beside him during the hearing. She had worn a dark navy suit tailored to her tall and graceful frame, her black curls tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her deep brown skin glowed under courtroom lights, and her posture carried the steady determination of someone who had spent her life fighting battles for others. When the judge read the ruling, Alexis looked at Ethan the way a sister might look at a brother returning from a long war. Ethan remembered the moment vividly. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. The judge, an older woman with a silver bun and sharp gray eyes, leaned forward as she spoke firmly. "Mr. Ethan Walker is the rightful inheritor. The assets in question, having been lawfully secured by the deceased, shall be released to him in full." Those words didn't feel real. Not then, not immediately after. Even now, months later, Ethan sometimes woke with the fear that it had been a hallucination, that he would blink and find himself again in the collapsing farmhouse, staring at debt letters. But the truth was now written in legal ink, and in the visible transformation surrounding him. Shadow padded through the snow beside him, heavier now with maturity. His fur had grown longer for winter, a thick black and tan coat that shimmered in the cold light. His harness, once crisp and new, was frayed at the edges, the white letters, "Service Dog," "Do Not Pet," dulled from months of work. Shadow wasn't just a partner anymore. He was a cornerstone of this new place, a living emblem of resilience. Ethan walked along the gravel path, knees stiff but steadier than before. Construction crews had come and gone, leaving behind structures that looked nothing like the ruined farmhouse that had greeted him a year ago. Where the dead vines once sagged, fresh rows of young grape plants stood wrapped in protective winter cloth. Between them rose new, wooden cabins, each built with wide porches and warm interior lighting. Steam drifted from the chimneys, curling into the cold sky. A pair of veterans passed Ethan on the path. One was Logan Pierce, a lean man in his 40s with close-cropped sandy hair and a rugged jaw softened by a friendly smile. A former Army medic, Logan walked with a prosthetic leg, an expertly crafted carbon fiber model that clicked softly with each step. Despite the physical reminder of his past, his spirit remained light. He often told jokes that made the others groan and laugh in equal measure. Beside Logan walked Maria Delgado, a petite woman in her late 30s with shoulder-length black hair streaked with silver. Her skin was a warm olive tone, but her eyes carried shadows deeper than any winter frost. Maria had served in intelligence operations and moved with a quiet, almost feline grace, as though she still expected danger behind every corner. But here, on this land, she had begun to breathe easier again. Logan lifted a hand. "Morning, Ethan. Snow's not letting up, huh?" Ethan nodded, a rare smile tugging at his mouth. "Never does." Maria offered a gentle nod. "Shadow looks proud today." Shadow wagged his tail, pressing briefly against Ethan's leg before trotting ahead to inspect the walkway. The central building, once the collapsing farmhouse, was now the beating heart of the property. Renovated from foundation to rafters, it held therapy rooms, a communal dining hall, and a workshop where veterans learned trades: carpentry, metalwork, canine training. Light spilled through large windows, golden and warm. Inside, Ethan found Dr. Helen Avery, one of the new staff members. Helen was in her mid-50s, tall and willowy, with soft gray hair braided over her shoulder and pale blue eyes framed by gentle wrinkles. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had spent 30 years guiding people out of darkness. She greeted Ethan with a smile that showed quiet pride. "2 more arrivals tomorrow," she said, consulting her tablet. "A Marine corporal and a retired Air Force technician, both bringing their dogs." Ethan nodded, absorbing the information. Helen continued, "You've built something real here, something that will outlive you." Ethan looked around the room, at the photographs on the wall showing graduations from therapy programs, at the boots lined neatly near the door, at the laughter drifting from the kitchen. "This place wasn't mine to build alone," he said quietly. From outside came the joyful chorus of barking. Ethan stepped onto the porch with Shadow. Beyond the cabins, veterans played fetch with their service dogs, snow flying in soft arcs. Others practiced breathing exercises with therapists. A few were simply sitting by the fire pits, sharing stories only soldiers could understand. The sign at the entrance read, "Walker Haven, where warriors find their way home." Ethan stood under the pale winter sun, looking out at the land that had nearly swallowed him whole. Now it had become a sanctuary, a second chance, a mission built not from destruction, but rebuilding, something he had never imagined could be his purpose. He knelt beside Shadow, brushing snow from the dog's back. "We made it," Ethan whispered. "And we're not done yet." Shadow pressed his head into Ethan's chest, amber eyes soft. The vineyard no longer slept under death. It lived, one breath, one veteran, one dog at a time. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder, revelation, or angels in the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, like a tired man finding purpose again on frozen ground, like a loyal dog who never gives up on the human he was entrusted to guard, like a ruined vineyard that becomes a place of healing for warriors who thought their story had already ended. If you look closely, God's fingerprints are often found in the smallest corners of our daily lives, in the kindness of strangers, in second chances we never expected, and in the quiet strength that carries us through our darkest winters. May this story remind you that no matter how broken a past may be, grace can still rebuild it. And if you believe in that little spark of hope, then say a prayer tonight for every soldier, every service dog, and every weary soul still searching for their way home. If this story touched your heart, please share it so it can reach someone who needs it. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, keep you safe, and guide you through every season of your life.